Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I want to talk about an article from Polygon called Games Need to Return to Black and White Morality. And this was brought to my attention by one of my subscribers. And the thing is that when you read that title, you might think to yourself, well, RJ should be right on board with that, right? He's always talking about virtue and vice. Shouldn't a traditional hero return to black and white morality? But when you read this article, it is something entirely different. It is something that is meant to bring you back to a black and white morality where you and every other person is stripped of their free choices, of their free will. And this article centers around the idea of hero because, of course, the traditional idea of hero is contingent upon free choice. However, before I get into that, there's a couple of housekeeping things that I have to attend to. First of all, I would like to talk at length about my own graphic novel that is coming up, which is called Thomas Valiant. I want to talk about the stretch goals and the perks for my Indiegogo campaign, but I want to know from my audience, where would you like me to do that? I was thinking maybe I would do it as a separate video during the week and not interfere with my weekend videos. Or I could try and do a live stream. I don't know if I can or not with my system, but I could try and do so. So I'd like to know where my audience would like to express to me what they would like within these stretch goals and perks. And you can do so in the comments of this video if you would like. And certainly tell me which of those two formats you would like to discuss this in. Secondly, I want to tell you about a new project, not my project, but a new project that is coming up on Indiegogo on Tuesday, the 18th of August, 2020. And it is called FATL, written FATL. Now, this is the new project being put up by Clint from Sweetcast, but the reason I want to tell you about it is because of the artist. The artist is Charlie Snogans, and Charlie and I have been talking for a while now about heroes, and I would consider Charlie to be a friend of mine. So that's number one why I want to bring this to your attention. But I have a second reason, which is purely mercenary, in the fact that Charlie has graciously agreed to do one of the pinup posters for my campaign. So if you go over to this Indiegogo campaign that is starting in a couple of days called FATL, and you like the art, and Charlie's art is just so beautiful and detailed, I think it's going to make a spectacular addition to the art of my main artist for the book, who is Renzo Rodriguez. But my point is that if you like Charlie's art, you will see some of this art within my campaign. So at the very least, I'd say you should go over and take a look at this campaign and see some of Charlie's art. I will put the link in the description for the campaign, and I will also put the Twitter handles of both Charlie and my main artist, who is Renzo Rodriguez, in the description of this video. Now, having gotten that out of the way, I want to go back to this Polygon article. And as I said, it is talking primarily about video games, but to some extent about comics, and how the stories within these mediums and the heroes within these stories should go back to a black and white morality. Now, when you start reading the article, you'll see that it seems to have a fairly even tone, and it appears that the author is talking about going back to black and white morality as we understand it, and getting rid of all these gray areas and this gray morality which pervades within modern storytelling. But when you get to the end of the article, you will see just how heavily progressive this person is. And I kind of expected that to begin with, because Polygon is owned by Vox, and Vox is heavily progressive. But near the end of the article, she starts talking about things like the current era of bourgeoisie social change, and how the idea of gray morality is a mindset of privilege, because it makes the mistaken, in her estimation, the mistaken assumption that good people are right next to bad people, and it only takes a little nudge to make someone from good to bad and bad to good, which means the oppressor can claim, oh look, I'm almost oppressed, look, I'm being oppressed, which of course in the progressive mindset is a no-no. You can't have people who are viewed as the oppressors saying that, look, it only takes a little nudge for me to become like you. They can't allow that. So here is what I would say is going on with this article. This is part of the end stage of the progressive movement. Because what the progressive movement has been trying to do for the last 50, 60, almost 80 years is to take traditional morality and to flip it on its head, and to make what was traditionally viewed as evil as good, and what traditionally was viewed as good as evil. Now, this is something that has been going on historically for quite some time now. for about 300 to 500 years. You have had people trying to do this flipping over of good and evil. But the progressives do it in a very, very subtle way. Of course, because you have the progressive ideology, which teaches that you need to do things slowly. The slow march through the institutions is the way that they maneuver. And most people would probably think about it in terms of the boiling frog scenario, where you turn up the heat just little by little so people don't recognize it. And so their tactic over the last 50 to 80 years wasn't to flip everything completely on its head right away. It was simply to take everything and turn it on its side. But the end of this entire process was eventually to flip it over. And this is what I think is happening right now, especially with articles like this. They are starting to flip it back over so that traditionally what was seen as good is now evil, and vice versa. So I'm only going to use this article as a bit of a springboard to talk about those ideas. But first, I want to talk about a couple of the comments that were at the bottom of this Polygon article, which I'll link in the description if you want to go read it, by the way. But these 2 points that were brought out by the comments on this article do play into what I'm going to talk about within this video as well. First of all, it shows the inherent racism of these people that are on the progressive side. Because a lot of the comments, and there are a lot of comments, and most of it is progressives firebombing this article. One of the major strains of thought that is in these comments is the fact that they're saying, how could this woman, who is also Asian, write such an article? How could she say such things? And they're just boggled, saying that, look, she's a woman and she's not white. How could she say such racist and hateful things? Because that's what the progressives who read Polygon are calling this. Which, of course, that mindset has as its basis that the only ones who can be racist are white people. They're automatically racist. And everyone who is a man is also misogynistic, automatically. But you have a woman here. She is obviously a saint by virtue of being A, a woman, and B, a person of non-white skin color. Therefore, how can she be saying these things? Which again, of course, shows the fact that these people are just inherently racist. However, the second strain of criticism that runs through these comments is a bit of a head scratcher when you first hear it. What a lot of the people in the comments are saying is that this article, in an attempt to set up ideas of black and white morality, is hateful towards trans and non-binary people. Why? Well, because within the article, she's saying that those gray areas, which are a transitory motion from good to evil, need to be eliminated. And we need to set up this dynamic of good and evil, which is, of course, a binary. Therefore, saying to get rid of these transition phases and to set up the binary of good and evil, that is hatred towards trans and non-binary people. And no, I'm not making this up. This is one of the major strains of discussion within the comments after this article. And I want to add just briefly, do you remember the time 20, 30 years ago where you had these progressive people and they said, look, I just want to live how I want to live. I'm not forcing anything upon you. Just let me do what I want to do. And you people saying that we're going to force this on others, that's never going to happen. And yet, here we have these people saying that if you believe in the idea of good and evil, you are automatically full of hatred and a bigot towards minorities because it is contrary to the fundamental ideas of how some of these people wish to live as trans and non-binary people. But anyway, to get back to my main point, whereas I would say this article and movements like this article that are now happening is a way to flip good and evil back upright, but where evil is now on top and good is on bottom. And to get to that idea, I want to look at a thinker who tried to do this all at once. Now, I have a video out there, which is one of the videos that keeps on getting views. Most of my videos, when they're dead, they're dead. Nobody watches them anymore. But this video just keeps on getting views. And it's my video about Nietzsche. And it's a bit of a polarizing video because about half of the comments are positive and half of the comments are negative. But I have to say that Nietzsche is one of the things I had to study a lot within university because I have 2 undergraduate degrees and a handful of majors. One of them was philosophy and the other one was political theory. And if you take those 2 disciplines, you had to go through a bunch of Nietzsche classes because I had to strain and struggle to get medieval philosophy and to some extent classical philosophy and political science but Nietzsche was just all over the place. And in order to fill up your course load, you had to take some. And so I took probably about half a dozen courses on Nietzsche. And the thing is, what Nietzsche tried to do was he tried to flip good and evil completely upside down. Again, so that good is evil and evil is good. But he tried to do it all at once. There was a little bit of transition in his thought, wherein he brought people back towards an ancient Greek way of understanding and thinking. But then, almost on top of that, he flipped things right over. And the reason why I want to talk about this briefly is because the way Nietzsche did this was concentrating on the central point of will. I always think of it in terms of the visual of an hourglass, whereas on the top you have good, and on the bottom you have evil, and the central point wherein the sand flows through is the human being, and more specifically the human will. And Nietzsche tried to use that central point to flip everything over. Now, one crucial point about my study of Nietzsche is that a lot of people who are studying it along with me, and even myself for a little bit, saw Nietzsche's way of thinking as being completely new. Something that no one had ever really talked about before. But at the same time, I was also reading Augustine of Hippo. And the thing is that Augustine of Hippo, back in the late 300s AD, came up with the idea of will that we still use today. This idea of will that the progressives are now trying to destroy. But we've used this idea of will for the last 1600 years. And the thing was that if you read Nietzsche side by side with Augustine of Hippo again being the person who explained the idea of will that we still use today, if you read those two thinkers side by side, you will see that Nietzsche doesn't come up with anything new at all. All he does is take everything that Augustine said and again flips it completely on its head. Now, I'll get back to Augustine in a few minutes, but let's bring this into the current article and this current progressive attempt to flip things over. This hourglass for the progressives is slightly different. This figure of an hourglass for the progressives I would see as follows. Traditionally, what you had at the top of the hourglass was reality. And the thing is that that would connect with what is good, because in the traditional morality, what is good, and therefore reality is good. So that's what you have on the top. And again, at the central point, you have the human being and the will. And at the bottom, you have the subjective. Everything that flows from the subject, the person, the individual themselves, their individual thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of these subjective things. And within this dynamic, this traditional dynamic, the reality that is on top needs to flow through the individual, through their will, and shape the subjective that is on the bottom. And this is the way traditional morality works. And certainly this is the way that the idea of hero works, because it's all filtered through right reason, which then leads into prudence, and then downward into the larger and more pervasive virtues of justice, fortitude, and temperance. But of course, what the progressives have done for the last, again, 50 to 80 years is to take that hourglass and simply to tip it on its side, and to say to everyone, look, there is no such thing as good and evil. There is only gray. And they tried to convince everyone of this and have done a fairly good job doing so. But now, within the last 5 to 10 years, they have started to flip this hourglass back upright, so that the subjective is on the top and it flows through the individual and it goes into the objective reality on the bottom. That is to say, they're trying to convince people that since they have flipped everything upside down, that the subjective is in control and the subjective is what controls what actually happens in reality through the individual and the individual will, which is expressed only, of course, through the society, not through the individual. And we can see this, of course, with the progressive movements, where people claim that I'm a 12-legged spirit unicorn, and because I feel subjectively like I am that shapes the reality of what I actually am. And here's the thing. I would say that this traditional idea of good and evil, of morality that we've had for the last, well, I'd say 3,000 years at least, it was originally flipped upside down. When you go back to almost the prehistory of European civilization, yes, it was flipped the other way. Whereas you had at the top these basically warlords who were lording it over everybody and saying, according to their subjective whims, they declare what is right and wrong. And this is what these progressives are trying to move us backwards towards. Just like Nietzsche was trying to move everybody backwards first towards this ancient Greek thought, and then towards flipping everything over, so it is with the progressives. They are trying to move us backwards in time. Backwards first to the philosophical ideas of the Greeks and Romans, and more specifically, the errors within that kind of thinking. Then backwards even more through mythology, and mythology taught through the idea of hero, and then back even further where you have these people who control society simply by force. And to express that again, to look at it in a linear fashion from the beginning to what we have now, it would go as follows. First of all, you had these ancient societies, which were barely societies to begin with, and they were ruled by warlords. These people who had absolute control through power, and what they said was right, and what they said was wrong. But eventually, they became more civilized. And the process whereby they became more civilized was through, in my estimation, to a great extent, the stories of mythology and its setting up of the idea of hero. And it ingrained within the minds of these rulers, generation after generation, that if you wish to be a ruler, then you need to be virtuous. You need to have these virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And you first need to have wisdom or right reason in order to even get there. And so these rulers became civilized through this idea of hero and through mythology. And then that brought them into philosophy, where they started to lay these things down in a systematic way. But that philosophy still had holes in it, and it still had problems. And so this brings us forward up into the point where we have Augustine, where he's trying to take all of this idea of virtue, this idea of the will, this idea of good and evil, and to run it through a rational theological framework in order to give us what we have today. So again, the point of these progressives, what they're trying to do is they're trying to drive us backward through history. They've already driven us backward into the errors of the Greeks and the Romans. They are trying now to use mythology to eclipse these rational systems, mythology that is expressed within games and within comics, and they are trying to bring us backward right to that point where the hero is destroyed, so that once again they can have these overlords that control society, and they control it simply through power, because that's all the progressive worships. They worship power above all else. Now, I want to talk about that for a few minutes, to say the least. This will probably be a long video, but I want to talk about all of that through looking at Augustine of Hippo and his setting up of this idea of will, again, that we still use today. And here's the thing. I know I have a lot of people in my audience who are people of faith, but I also have a lot of people in my audience who are atheists. And the thing is that if you're an atheist and you wish to understand a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about, well, you need to understand a Christian theology. You simply do. This is one of the things that the progressives actually get right. They say that they want to destroy all of this because it's all based upon this Christian morality. And it is. If you look again at Augustine of Hippo, he is writing this idea of what the will is, again, in the late 300s, and we still use it today. And he wrote it in the 14th book of the City of God Against the Pagans. And although his books are more like chapters, this is a book which takes 13 other books prior to that and explains things according to a theological mindset in order to get to this idea of will, again, that we still use today. So it is quite definitely built upon this idea of Christian morality and Christian theology. And again, I'm not trying to convince atheists to go and become Christian, but at the very least, you need to understand why Christians actually believe what they do, at the very least intellectually, because if you discard all of that knowledge completely, you are leaving yourself open with a giant hole where the progressives can simply drive their truck of progressivism right through. But I don't think a lot of people actually get that point, that you actually do need to understand, at the very least intellectually, where all of these Christian ideas come from and the theology behind them in order to understand many of the fundamental principles that we still live by today. Because I'm sure a lot of the atheists out there might say, yeah, I still have a free will. Some of them don't. But to those of them that think they still have a free will and use that idea of free will that we have been using for the last 1600 years, that's all based upon Christian morality. And I say all of that because I'm going to have to discuss some of that to understand the idea of will, to understand the idea of good and evil, and to understand the mechanism whereby it was delivered for the last 1600 years, which again, the progressives are trying to destroy. Now, again, if you're an atheist, you can think about all of this religious talk as simply mythology if you want, but at the very least, it gives you a continuous way of thinking about the argument based upon some givens. And of course, any logical and rational argumentation, as Aristotle said in the very beginning lines of his works on logic, every form of argumentation proceeds upon pre-existent knowledge. You have to take some of these things as a given. And just briefly, as an atheist, if you don't wish to take these fundamental points as a given, then you'll have to figure out some way to set up fundamental points that align with your own worldview that allow for free will to actually exist. And that's not going to be an easy thing. You certainly cannot do it within your lifetime. You will simply have to start building it now, because these ideas that I'm talking about took a couple of millennia to actually emerge from civilization. So if you want to set up a new norm, you're probably going to start now, and maybe within 1,000 to 2,000 years you might have it. But again, simply to eradicate the old givens of the old systems of morality is simply leaving a giant hole for the progressives to fill with their nonsense and their non-rational ways of convincing people to think about reality. So, after all of that, to go back to the original idea of what is good and evil within the traditional norms of Western civilization, well, evil doesn't actually exist as a thing within itself. Good does. Good exists within a thing within itself. That is God. And this way of thinking all goes back to the first chapters of the Bible, which is from Genesis, wherein it talks about the creation of the universe, where God, the good, created the entire universe and everything in it and everything that will ever exist, and then he sat back and said, "It is good." Now, this statement of "it is good" is taken to have supreme authority and a supreme impact on everything that follows. Why? Well, because the line of reasoning goes this way. If God created everything that will ever exist at that point, and everything was good, therefore evil at that point did not exist, and evil, therefore, is not a thing. So what is evil then? Well, evil is a state of movement. And a state of movement in what way? Well, it's a state of movement away from the good. So the good is a thing in itself. It is, by these definitions, God. And a movement away from that good is what is evil. Because evil, again, is not a thing within itself. It's simply a movement away from what is good. Now, this also can be seen in the fact that, again, everything that was created was labeled as good. Therefore, reality itself is good. And therefore, a movement away from what is real is also a movement away from what is good. And therefore, it is evil. That is to say, falsehoods and lies are what is evil. And here's where we get into the idea of the will. Because, of course, how does this movement away from the good actually occur? Well, it only occurs through the fact that human beings are allowed to have a free will. And again, this all goes back to Genesis, where it has God creating man, and man being made in the image of God. Now, that image is not that God has hands and fingers, arms and legs. It's that human beings are like God in so much as God is the ultimate free will. And so he has imposed this stamp upon us, allowing us the free will, which is an exact copy of his own. And although we don't have the same power as he does, we have the same ability to use that will, even to the extent that we are allowed to use our free will to turn away from what is real, to turn away from reality, to turn away from God and the good, and to turn towards darkness, lies, and evil. But the important part here is the fact that the free will reigns supreme within the human being. Everything, all motion of the human being is either directed towards the good or away from the good. And all of that movement is controlled by the will. And this drills down right even into the emotions. Because, once again, it goes back to that biblical idea that God is love and everything is dependent upon love. But the thing is that that love is the motion towards or away from what is good. And that's where our emotions come from. That's what Augustine talks about. If you have what is loved, then that is joy. If you want something that you love, that is desire. If you shrink away from that which you do not love, that is fear. If you are enduring the results of what you fear that has already been imposed upon you, then that's sorrow. But all of this includes a movement to or away from what is good, and that movement is again controlled by the will. And this is why the individual will is so supremely important within the ideas of Western civilization, and why you have the ability within current civilization to express your will how you wish it to be expressed. And briefly, on top of all of that, we have the system whereby this idea of the will was put into Western civilization, and it was mainly through theology. Now again, some of you atheists out there might just think of this theology as a new kind of mythology, but it was a different mythology from your ancient Greek and Roman way of thinking about things, because essentially it was supposed to, and I repeat that, supposed to be based upon a rationality. That is to say, this theology was supposed to be taught in a way that it could not ask you to believe anything that was contrary to reason. And from there, I want to bring out 2 points. Number one, you couldn't have anything contrary to reason, because again, this is Christianity and it's based upon Christ, who is said to be the truth, with a capital T. Therefore, anything that is contrary to the truth must therefore be a lie and must be excluded from this theology. And anything contrary to reason, that is to say, reason which is derived from reality and the systems of reality, it must be in alignment with the truth, because of course the truth is the word spoken that created this reality to begin with. And secondly, I have to point out that there is a secondary factor which has to be considered here when thinking about that. When they are saying that we are not going to ask you to believe anything that is contrary to reason, that is not to say that they don't ask you to believe things which they deem to be beyond the human reason to understand. And the easiest way to explain that is if you look at the idea of infinity. Now, as human beings, we can understand the concept of the infinite, but we cannot hold something infinite within our own minds, because our minds are finite and our existence is finite, and therefore we simply cannot do that. But if, in order to understand something, this reason requires that you hold the infinite in your mind while thinking about all the other aspects of it, we simply cannot do that. But that is not contrary to reason. It is simply something beyond our reasoned abilities. But if you prove that what you are trying to teach according to this theology is contrary to reason and is irrational, then it must be a falsehood and must be gotten rid of. So the system whereby this theology, or if you want to call it this mythology of Christianity, was according to reason and set up according to reason and must be according to the rational. But the old system of the Greek mythology was not subject to that rationality. And that's an important factor to consider when you look at the progressives trying to drive us backwards into the ideas of the ancient Greeks. And again, the progressives wish to destroy all of that to bring us backwards into the ideas, first of all, of what the will used to be considered, and then driving it again straight backward into the almost prehistory of man, wherein only the will of the warlord, the absolute ruler of the state, was what mattered. And we can see this pretty clearly if we look once again at Augustine, when he was setting up in the late 300s this idea of will that we still use today. Because one of his opponents that he was using as his foil was the Stoics and the Platonists. And while he said they had some good ideas, they were wrong here, here, and here. And we can see this with the Stoics, because the Stoics said that some emotions were bad in themselves. That sorrow itself is bad, and that a wise man who is a Stoic cannot ever be sorrowful, although they do use different terms for this. If you look at people like Cicero, they use the Latin terms of agoratudo and dolor, which can be translated into the terms of sickness and pain, but what they were talking about was sadness. And they were saying that if you were a wise man and a Stoic, you could never actually be sad. But in Augustine's system, he's saying, no, it's the movement of the will that makes things good or evil. So all of these emotions can be played out in either a good or an evil way. Everything, even things like hatred and fear. Hatred and fear are not always bad. They can be bad, but there can be a good hatred and a good fear. Because if you hate what is false and you hate a lie, that's a good hatred. If you fear being deceived by a lie, then that's a good fear. And the same thing with love. There is not only a good love, there is a good love in a bad love. If you place your love upon a falsehood, upon a lie, that is an evil love. But again, within the ideas of the Stoics, some of these emotions were in themselves bad, and you could never have them. And this is exactly what the progressives have moved us back into for the last at least 50 years, with ideas like love is love. And they're trying to convince everybody that, well, basically, their licentiousness can be lived out because it's just love, and all love is good, right? Because God is love, and therefore no love can be bad. This is what the progressives have been drilling into people's heads for at least 50 years now. But this is not the way Western civilization actually sees things. Western civilization says, no, there is a good love, and there is an evil love. Love is not just automatically good. And the same with evil. You have the progressives saying that hate is always bad, hate is always evil. But no, again, if you look at the traditional way that will is actually played out within the Western civilization for the last 600 years, and the way our civilization is built upon it, there can be a good hatred. Because hatred of what is false and what is untrue is a good hatred. And that's just what they've been teaching us for the last 50, 60 years. If we look at more recent events and what they tried to drive us backwards into recently, they've tried to drive us backwards into the way that the ancient Greeks and Romans looked at the idea of will. And before Augustine, you had this different idea of what the will was, which was what the Greeks and the Romans conceived it to be. And it was something that, although it was similar to what we think of as the will, it could be negated over and over again by these larger domineering forces that were primarily seen as mythological forces. Forces like Moira, or Ate, or the Thumos, or chance, destiny, fate. Also the different incarnations of doom. All of these things, all of these bigger mythological forces could negate the will of the individual. And we see this exact thing within your progressive ideology as well. There are these overarching social, societal forces that dominate you to the extent that you cannot exercise your will in any other way. We see this expressed primarily by the idea of whiteness. If you are born white, you're a racist, and there's nothing that you can do to extract yourself from that. There is no action of the will that will allow you to extract yourself from that. You may lessen your impact upon others, but you can never get rid of it. And of course, the color of your skin is not determined by any free choice. And so this is an overarching, almost mythological force which has control over your destiny and control over your will. And of course, the same thing is true of if you're born a man. You're automatically labeled as misogynistic. You're automatically seen as someone who needs to be mistrusted. And again, this is not something you had any choice in the matter of becoming, but it controls your will from this point outward. And the same is true of the reverse. If you're a woman, if you're a person who doesn't have white skin, well, automatically you're virtuous. Automatically you're seen as being heroic, just because you are born with lady parts, just because you are born with a different color skin. And this negates, once again, your ability to choose. Although it's in a positive way rather than a negative way for the whiteness, it's still a negation of your ability to choose. And as I said previously, this brings us back to a very essential part of the history of human beings within Western civilization. Because this brings us back to the point which is the divide between your warlord-like kings who ruled simply by force and their civilized nature, which was expressed within and through mythology and was controlled by this mythology in order to bring about a heroic ideal for rulers. Because this is the point which is being talked about within this Polygon article. The point that stories, and especially hero stories, within games and within comics, is supposed to be the guiding force, the guiding light towards understanding this new idea of the progressive hero. And this is what brings me into comics. Because of course, if you listen to my videos, you know that for the last 2 years, I've been harping upon this interview, which was done with the #2 person at Marvel Comics, the person in operational control of Marvel Comics, who specifically said that Marvel is setting up a new mythology, and that this new mythology should be used in a psychological way in order to push what she calls positive ideas. And of course, if you listen to the rest of that interview, it is progressive ideas that she labels as positive. So Marvel and these comics are the new mythology set up to be the contrary of what we saw within ancient Greece. This mythology within ancient Greece was used to extract us out of violence into civilization. But this new mythology, this progressive mythology that you see expressed primarily within heroes, within comic books and games, it is meant to draw us backwards into the idea that these ideas of heroes that has been prominent for the last 3,000 years, this is false. And we need to go back to a dynamic of power rules absolutely. Because, again, if you listen to my channel for any length of time, you will see that these new progressive heroes, quote unquote heroes, that Marvel especially is producing, these characters and their actions boil down to nothing but raw power that is overcoming those around them. They are not virtuous in any way, and they certainly don't use free acts of the will in order to show their heroism. No, it is the reality of the story that is warping and twisting around them in order to show that their power and their authority is therefore the legitimate power and authority. And this is why I harp upon the idea of heroes so much, especially within these kinds of stories. They were clearly even stated by Marvel to be the new mythology, to set up these new principles of ideology, these new principles of heroism, these new principles of how you're actually supposed to act. And if you look at them closely enough, you'll see that in doing so, what they want to bring you back to is a point wherein your individual will no longer matters. Where the traditional idea of good is now evil and evil good, and where if you wish to believe in any concept of good and evil, or wish to express your will in any way, the only system whereby you are allowed to do that is through the concentrated power of the progressives who control society. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.